impossible to talk about reclaiming indigeny without also talking about why we have to go through this reclamation process. Well, if we once had indigeny and we don't have it now, what happened in between? Monotheism happened. And that's a very difficult thing for some people to accept. A few weeks ago, I and several colleagues, coming from various indigenous traditions, we had a couple of Dagra elders, that's an African tradition. We had a magnificent Kemetic elder, a woman who grew up in Cuban Santeria, and me. And I think there was a woman practicing Druidism as well. We were all invited to present workshops at a conference. And about a month or two before the conference, there started to be a lot of hostility on the coordinator's list. We had an email list for organizational purposes. And there started to be a lot of hostility directed at the idea of indigeny, for the specific reason that you can't talk about reclaiming indigeny without talking about how it was lost. And that's a story of genocide, conquest, colonialism, and slavery. And those things might make people uncomfortable. So there was a tremendous amount of hostility directed prior to the conference to those of us speaking about our indigenous traditions. A great deal of attempted censorship, which did not succeed. Many, many inoffensive suggestions that bled into outright racism, to the point that at the conference, all presenters of color were segregated in the basement, which was not on the handout that was given to attendees. Things were so bad at this conference that all of the Native American presenters refused to present. The rest of us slogged on. I don't blame them. The rest of us slogged on through. I marched my class right down to the basement, and we desegregated the basement. And no one amongst the coordinators found this unusual. No one looked at it and said, well, this is racist. They wanted to get the people speaking about indigeny off the main floor, where attendees and other presenters would not be made uncomfortable by having to face the questions that we've already spoken about. I was the only one of the 5 of us who was allowed to present on the primary floor, partly because my name is very well known, and partly because I have white skin. So when someone tells me that white privilege doesn't exist, I tell them they're full of shit. It was a real shock. I mean, it's one thing to know intellectually that this exists. And it's another to be put in situations where you are slapped in the face with it and the harm that it does. I mean, I never thought about it for years. But then as I started to do this work and engage more readily with my ancestors, they started demanding, for the honor of their line, that I look at these things. And I started finding myself being thrust into positions where it had to be addressed. I would think, I'm lucky, I have really obnoxious ancestors who don't give me much leeway in being stupid. But I found that being put in a situation where I was lumped in with my African American colleagues and my Hispanic colleagues, just by virtue of the fact that I was talking about indigeny, and given a tiny taste, just a tiny little taste, of what they have to deal with every single bloody day. That was, I'm tearing up as I think about it. That was huge for me. You don't know. We take for granted our position. And one of the challenges in engaging with our ancestors and really reclaiming our indigenous traditions is putting aside, is acknowledging and being willing to let go of white privilege. I say this, and I have been accused of being a bigot who oppresses white people. I say this, and I have been accused of, quote, European bashing. And it's not. There are ancestral wounds, and these things need to be acknowledged in order that they can be healed. Because we do no honor to ourselves, we do no honor to our traditions, we do no honor to our gods, and we do no honor to our ancestors by holding on to these fallacies. What we do is harm. And there's nothing wrong with being white. There's nothing wrong with being black. If you showed me someone that was green with purple polka dots, I mean, I'm sure there would be nothing wrong with that either. It's not about race. Race is an artificial construct that was born out of the depredations of monotheism and colonialism. As a classicist in training, if you took someone out of the ancient Roman Empire and said, "What are you?" they would say, "I'm Roman, I'm Ethiopian, I'm Egyptian." They wouldn't say, "I'm black, I'm white, I'm brown." If you took one of our ancestors far back, when we were still living in tribes, and said, "What are you?" they'd probably look at you and say, "What do you mean, what am I? I'm a person. Are you crazy? What are you?" So I want to put that out there. Race is very much the racial divides that we have in our culture. That is in part, that's part of the depredation. The racism, the misogynism, the homophobia. These things come from monotheism. And with monotheism, which is more than a religion, it's not a religion, it's a way of engaging and looking at the world. It is a filter, a mental filter that deifies singularity. And that obsession, that fetishization of singularity doesn't just stop in the religious sphere. It doesn't just stop with saying there is one God. It bleeds out into every aspect of a person's life. We live in a world that is obsessed with binaries, good and evil, black and white. And that's a result of that fixation on singularity. It doesn't just stop with saying there's one God. Then there's one right way to honor that one God. And things snowball from there. But I find that in academia, you have this idea of the hierarchy of religions, where the closer you get to a very Protestant Christianity, the, quote, more evolved something is. And it's a load of shit. Our ancestral polytheisms were complex and rich and did not need to evolve. In fact, I would say that we have devolved. In the grand scheme of religious life, for the hundreds of thousands of years that we have been on this planet, monotheism is a very young mutation. Very young. But all too often, given that many of our intellectual disciplines like anthropology and sociology and religious studies and even classics really came into fruition, came into being in the late 19th century, you have a very Victorian mindset. You have disciplines that were impacted by their birth during the height of British colonialism. And it shows, it shows, where anything that is indigenous, anything that is animist, anything that is polytheistic is somehow primitive. And if those indigenous polytheisms happen to involve people with dark skin, well, then there is the unspoken attitude that it is definitely primitive. And oh, how happy we ought to be so evolved and superior. And I say this to those heathens out there who are working to restore Germanic traditions, to Celtic reconstructionists who are working to restore Celtic traditions, to Comitics, you name it. We even have people working to restore Canaanite and Sumerian traditions, and that fills me with joy. It's about time. I've often been accused of not wanting a religiously diverse society. Oh, I do. I want people to joyfully honor the gods that they are called to honor. What I don't want is a society where monotheism is the dominant paradigm. Because look around you. How well is it working?